The US military is now facing a new dilemma within Africa. How do we not fall apart like the French military and become one of the biggest embarrassments throughout the world? Now, when we talk about Africa, I don't want to generalize all of Africa because understand this, although the United States has a presence throughout Africa, we're really talking about what's called the Sahel region within Africa, also known as one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Now, there's a lot of correlation between Sahel and countries falling apart. For example, throughout that Sahel belt I just showed you, all of these countries have fallen to coups, one of the most recent ones being Niger, Africa. Now, as far as all of the countries you see here, another direct correlation is they used to be former French colonies, but not only that, this is sort of the first time where the United States is dealing directly with a coup and having to work with opposition, the coup leaders, and still fight alongside them with the common enemy throughout the Sahel, which are really bad guys, militant groups. You can't say the word here on YouTube, but that is why we are located in Niger, Africa, to be smack dab in the middle of the Sahel. So this is not the first time the French have been booted out of an African country, and it probably won't be the last. As long as France sticks around Africa, it's most likely that country after country is going to follow suit and just kick out the French because they don't see that they're getting anything out of the French. Now, as far as the French leaving countries, many people will cheer about it, but to be honest with you, there's also another direct correlation that every time France leaves a country, that country does seem to have an uptick in violence and more extreme groups coming into the country. It almost creates like a power vacuum. Now, Mali, Africa always seems to be the case study to show the direct correlation between France pulling out of a country and all of a sudden that country starts to have an uptick in violence. Here in 2020, you have 376 violent attacks. Again, even if France is in a country, there still are attacks. Now, we'll go from 2020 all the way up to 2023 up here, and you can see the mass amounts of attacks because, again, the French were kicked out, and the French actually went to Niger from Mali. That's a whole nother story, but we'll stick to the issue at hand. The French leaving and the United States staying, because here in Mali, it wasn't only the French getting kicked out, it was also Russia coming in, and that also seems to be another trend that Russia does. Throughout the Sahel region, where all these countries have fallen to coups, there also is a very weird undertone of Russian influence, where Sudan was one of the first countries Russia went into Africa to support. And when Sudan currently is facing a civil war and there's an uptick in violence, many people were confused as to how opposition leaders and forces were still getting enough ammunition. Where are they getting this money to supply the civil war? Turns out it was coming from the Russians. Now, Niger also hinted to possibly working with the Russians if the French were going to stick around and if Africa was going to want to go to war with Niger. But again, the other really big issue is this. The United States is smack dab in the middle of all of this. So the mission for the United States in Niger is a multi-level mission. You have a direct action role and you have an indirect action role. And what I mean by that is this. You have drones that are flying around in the areas of the Sahel on the border regions of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso. And these drones are providing reconnaissance for assets in the region, whether it's the French who are going to attack these bad guys or the U.S. is going to attack these bad guys. Preferably, the U.S. wants Nigerian troops to attack these bad guys. Nigerian troops. And so that's what the U.S. is doing. They are attacking bad guys directly, doing reconnaissance. But as of today, right now, according to the Pentagon, none of that is happening. Niger, Junta, the guys in charge of Niger, have authorized for the United States to be able to defend themselves because you can't just allow the military to sit there and not do their job. But nonetheless, the U.S. military is doing absolutely nothing right now to what they were doing before. So, as the U.S. military just sits here and wait, the country is just going to get worse and worse and worse. And the U.S. military is not going to stick around and find out to see, are we going to end up just like the French? The other massive underlying issue is that the countries of Mali and Burkina Faso have a treaty with Niger to help out Niger in attacking the bad guys. I hate saying the bad guys. It's the letter that starts with the T and ends with ist. You can't say it on YouTube. But the reason why this is an issue is because that means Mali and Burkina Faso, who are aligned with Wagner, who are aligned with Russia, will be working with Niger, but Niger is working with the United States. And I know this is rather complex, but the country of Syria sort of had this issue too, where the United States and the Russians were fighting technically the same common enemy, the same bad guys, but we're not friends with them. And so it looks like the same exact thing could happen in Africa, where Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, we're all working together to fight bad guys. But now Russia could indirectly possibly maybe attack U.S. troops like they did in Syria. You see how this becomes rather complex for the United States just to stick in Niger. It's not so much, hey, we're going to fight the bad guy. Now we're working with the Russians who are also doing bad things in Africa. Are we allowed to do this? One country that seems to stick out is Nigeria, for the U.S. military to potentially go to Nigeria after Niger. Nigeria is one of the strongest militaries in Africa. They have a very powerful military, but what's more important, they have a very stable country. So this seems likely to be the next region for the United States to move into, because they're not going to leave Africa, and they're especially not going to leave the Sahel. And Nigeria has great relations with the United States through military cooperation. I've even seen clips of the 82nd Airborne training with Nigeria, training their troops to do airborne operations. So it wouldn't be out of the question for the U.S. military to move into Nigeria. It also won't be the biggest move ever. Yes, we'll lose a lot of assets in Niger, like drone bases and such, but nonetheless, that could be fixed and reorganized over in Nigeria, where we won't be too far away from the fight. Now, there's a little bit of confusion from the French, because the French had the idea of, well, we're in your country, Niger, to help support, also fight alongside the United States and help Niger fight the bad guys. But that's not what the Junta saw, the guys in charge of Niger, and that's not what the people of Niger saw. In fact, they saw it different. They saw it as the French are trying to take advantage of us Africans who have been here way longer than the French have. The French colonized us, they left, but they're still here, and there's way too much French influence in our African country.
It will be organized over time in the weeks to come, but it is the end of this cooperation, because we are not here to participate in political life, to be hostages in some way to the putschists. But I will be very clear, we already see it today in Mali.
Niger's military junta welcomed France's withdrawal, saying, quote, imperialist and neo-colonialist forces are no longer welcome on our national territory. Any person, institution or structure whose presence threatens the interests and outlook of our country will have to leave the land of our ancestors, whether they like it or not.
Look, I think it's important not to give the impression that the U.S. military, they are the only ones doing all of the work out here in Africa as far as fighting militant groups. But the French also had a massive role and asset in doing this. But like you heard, the junta just felt like they are controlling our culture, and we don't want that here. Whereas the United States really has not had a lot of input on the culture of Niger. The United States is purely there to fight militant groups, and this is self-evident since the early 2000s when the United States first entered into the region, actually on behalf of the French, welcoming them to fight in the Sahel. So the United States has been there for a long time, more or less covert black ops, or black operations, if you will. Nonetheless, though, now it's way more public. People can look into the operations that are happening. But again, the United States, they're not the only one operating in the Sahel, but they are a massive asset in the fight against bad guys to help Niger. The number one saving grace for the United States to still be in Niger was the fact that the U.S. Special Forces and U.S. entities kept a relationship with the junta. The United States, again, I'm trying not to be super biased, but this is what the U.S. Special Forces do. They go into your nation and they train your troops. They're not there to change your culture, not there to teach you about the U.S. fighting way and all that, like we tried to do in Afghanistan and the Middle East. We're simply there to help your country to fight bad guys, because if we help you fight bad guys, those bad guys won't hurt us in the United States. And that's what special forces do. Now, they maintain this relationship for a very long time, unlike the French, and that's why the French are getting kicked out, and that's why the U.S. Special Forces are so good at their job. You can see here on a massive scale how their job was a complete success in not kicking us out. We also have to understand the United States never once called this a coup officially. In the U.S. military and the State Department, I think they knew it was a coup, but they said to never call it a coup. They always use the words, it appears like a coup, perhaps it's a coup, and I think Niger really appreciated that. But again, nonetheless, now that the French are out and now it's only going to be left up to the United States, where we know we're supporting a coup, and we probably shouldn't be doing that. It's not the greatest look. I don't know how the U.S. military and the United States can reconcile with that on a world stage where France can really call out the United States, and so can other African countries. So the U.S. is going to have to act really fast on whether or not they're still going to support this junta, because nonetheless, this is a coup. Like, everyone knows this is a coup in Africa. Legally speaking, the United States also needs to be very careful in aiding coups and juntas, because these guys could turn and still fight with the Russians and turn on the United States on the dime of the United States. Now, nonetheless, the United States has pulled some funding from Niger. I don't know how we're going to try to make this a legal situation, because again, per U.S. law, we are not allowed to support juntas or coups, and the United States nonetheless still said we will help Niger with humanitarian aid, but as far as helping their military and giving more money for technology, I don't know how we're going to be able to do that.
Now, it's not just French troops who are in Niger right now. Some 1,000 US troops are also in the country, and it's unclear at the moment whether they will stay there. Right now, the US Defense Secretary is visiting Central and East Africa.
So the closest thing we can do from sort of getting away from this entire situation was pulling US assets out of the capital of Niger, and we're sort of smack dab in the middle of an airbase called 201. And this airbase is where most US troops are situated right now, and we are currently just on standby waiting for orders. That's as far as we know. The news coming out of Niger with the United States is about a week or two behind. But the Pentagon has confirmed that the United States is solely on defensive operations. We are not attacking the enemy. We're not doing what we were doing before, as far as also training the troops of Niger. So right now, everything is turning into like this cesspool where it's potentially going to get worse and worse. And now that the French are leaving, one of the biggest wins for the Sahel region, for another country to fall apart. It goes to show how dangerous the Sahel is, but it also goes to show why the United States still needs to be in the Sahel. Many people say, pull out of Africa, United States shouldn't be there, don't do this. As far as the Sahel, we do need to be there, because again, when you look at Niger, the statistics show that there's less violence in the country. When you look at Mali and other countries who kicked out the French and they kicked out all of their security assets, it gets worse and worse, especially when you throw Russia into the mix, and especially when you throw China into the mix. So nonetheless, I don't know what we're going to do, and this is the dilemma the U.S. military will be facing in the coming weeks and months.